Hi, I'm Pastor Ben. This video is the online version of our Together Tuesday program called How the Light Shines Through, and it is correlating to the first chapter of the book by the same name written by Chad Lakeys. This video is made for those who either are not able to attend on Tuesday evenings, might live through distance, might not drive at night, or those who did attend but would like to review what it is that we talked about, because this book study that we're going through really has a lot of valuable insights for us, and I want to make it available to the largest possible audience. If you have suggestions about these videos, as this is still a little bit of an experiment, let me know, as we want to make this as robust and educational program as possible. Obviously, there's no classroom discussion because it's just me and the computer, but at least the content will be covered. So first, in this second video, correlating to chapter 1 of the book, it is helpful to review what we talked about last time. Last time, the emphasis was understanding the difference between social power and social trust, and the role of the church. Lakeys argues that what has been lost for Christians, whether they should have had it in the first place or not, is a different conversation, but what has been lost is what he calls Christendom, or what I would simply call social power. The ability for Christianity, not just Christian people who happen to be members of other things, but Christianity to kind of flex its muscles and be able to influence society. In doing that, Christians accomplished much. Some of it was good, some of it was bad. There are wonderful things that can happen by using social power. However, what it is not is social trust. And social trust is structured around building relationships. And today we would like to continue that because they really are different things. That's why I call it social power versus social trust. It's very hard to do both things at once. It's possible, but hard. And one of Lakeys' arguments is that the more Christians lean into taking back social power, the less they're going to build social trust. In fact, some of the reason they have lost social trust is because of their use of social power. And so today we want to continue this, but as a review, what instead he argues Christians need to do to build social trust is to be a winsome witness. To be a witness of the gospel of Jesus. At Central Lutheran, our mission statement is being the hands and feet of Jesus by serving God and one another, by loving one another, serving the community, sharing the gospel, and nurturing faithful living. And I always get those in the wrong order. But none of those are about social power. They're all about relationship and social trust. About being the gospel of Christ's church, because this is Christ's church, not ours. And so, being a winsome witness is to bear witness to who Christ is in the world for ourselves and for others. That's our call, sharing the good news. But, as this chapter points out, Christians have done unhelpful things that have helped erode trust. Most of Western Christianity, not all, but most of Western Christianity has seen decline. Well, there have been responses to that decline. And some of those responses have been distinctly unhelpful. And I would argue because they are counteracting the building of social trust, often by trying to take back social power, and are simply going to be counterintuitive and will not help, or not counter-effective, and will not help in the growth of the gospel of Jesus Christ. This chapter is looking at what he describes as three of those. How it is churches have lost social trust. And I think this isn't as simple as it first comes off as. Because, of course, the obvious thing is the aggressive abuse that have been done by some churches, both those who have abused others and then the way churches have tried to cover it up or tried to work outside of normal processes and have made it far worse both for families and for the PR in general, losing trust. But I think there's the argument in this chapter is it's more foundational than that. It's not just that there is bad behavior by a small portion, but that far more regular behavior by a lot of people, which would not be called abuse, is unhelpful. What is it we're doing, and how do we measure the actions of the church? One of the points of this book study for our congregation, and hopefully you, the viewers, is to get beyond just caricatures of what's going on in churches and instead be able to really address what is it and how is it that we can see what's happening for church in 2025 from real data and real rubrics of understanding. And so I'd like to introduce a measurement for trust. And I think part of our problem with understanding trust is that we think of it so vaguely and so widely that we don't really have an opportunity to analyze anything very carefully. Well, do you trust it or not is actually not an especially helpful question. And so I'd like to, this is not in the book, but something I think is very helpful, is to provide a rubric. And to do so, I'd like to introduce a video, a TED Talk by Honra O'Neill called What We Don't Understand About Trust. She is a philosopher of trust, gave this talk many years ago, and it provides some helpful background and basic structure for how to think about trust. And have we gotten it kind of the wrong way round? What is our role as the church in building trust? Well, you have to know what trust even is before we start. Now, there's a problem in that I am recording this and putting it on YouTube. YouTube doesn't allow to clip in a TED Talk. And so instead, I have put in the comments section on this video the active link to this TED Talk, Honra O'Neill, What We Don't Understand About Trust. It's 9 minutes long. I would like you to pause this video and go watch that TED Talk and then come back and complete this video. So I'd like you to do that now. Pause the video, watch the TED Talk. Welcome back. Now that you've seen this TED Talk by Honra O'Neill, I would invite us to think about what are some of her points that she is talking about, just trust generally, that can help us in thinking about building social trust and the church. Well, the first point that I think is maybe the most important takeaway is simply what trust is. That trust is something someone gives us. So it's not so easy for us to just to say, well, I'm going to go build trust. Well, trust is a gift others need to give to the church. And maybe one of the first things that Christians can do is to build trust within our own community. But once again, that's something that is given to us. We don't have control of that. Instead, she makes the point that it's not about trust, it's about trustworthiness. And trustworthiness is how we behave, because it is instead about our behaviors, not what we say, but what we're doing. And the reason for that is because in order to be trustworthy, she talks about being vulnerable, but she also talks about simply how we act, to have evidence that we are trustworthy. And so this is not a discourse of how do we talk, but instead how do we act? How do we fulfill this? And if we're being trustworthy and showing ourselves to be trustworthy, it comes out in three categories that I think is quite helpful. The first, she points out, is competence. What is it that the church is competent to do? That's an important question. The second is honesty. We have to be honest about what we're doing. And then the third is reliability. Are you going to fulfill what it is that you're competent to do? This is important because as we think about being a trustworthy body, that is the church, and being known as a trustworthy body, we have to look carefully. What are we competent at doing? And there's a lot of things we can do in the sense that we're able to do it, but is it our mission? Part of competence is not just what you're capable of doing, but is this what you should be doing? Some places in this country, still, the church does have the competence to have and exercise social power. That is a real thing in some places, others not. But is it what we should be doing? Is that what we're really competent to be doing? Is that going to be fulfilling our purpose and mission as the Church of Jesus Christ? That's a real question we have to recognize. The second one is we have to be honest. That one seems obvious, but part of honesty is vulnerability, is to saying, what are we able to do and what are we able not to do? Where have we failed in the past, which is usually not that hard to accept, but how are we struggling in the present about that? And we need to be able to name that. Name what's really happening. And then the third one is reliability. Are we fulfilling that mission? And of course, part of the distinctive thing is, of course, people make mistakes. That's not what this is about. But simply, how could we do that? And that I want to introduce as a kind of hermeneutic, an interpretive tool to look at how does the church behave. And then I'd like to look at the examples that Lakias gives us in chapter 1 of his book, and then to measure them based on that hermeneutic, on the trustworthiness from Honora O'Neill. The first is what Lakias calls relevance. How has the church responded to decline? We're going to make sure we're really relevant. And many of you know this picture from the Das Equis commercials, the so-called most interesting man in the world. And the idea here is that in order to for the church to move forward, we need to be really, really relevant and be really interesting, be really exciting, and get attention from others. We need to draw attention away from those other things and instead on church. We often hear this, well, the world has become so busy. The church is getting lost as one option among others. So because they're busy, let's produce new programming and new attention-grabbing things so that we'll gain attention instead of them. And this has been a movement, I think I'm most familiar with it, especially in, say, youth ministry, where we're going to provide all kinds of videos and exciting things to be a kind of Christian version of what is already exciting, and we will very obviously struggle and will not compete with what is actually popular and exciting. It doesn't matter what kind of YouTube videos I will create. I promise you that for our youth, I will not compete with this thing. And but that's seems to be the goal. Let's try to create a lot of attention. And then it becomes very performance-based, some sort of spectacular action. We're going to be exciting. And then, but also, it needs to be really authentic. It can't be a show we're putting on, even though it's a performance of something which is in and of itself a show. And this has become the challenge of this model. It doesn't really work. That is, are you the most interesting human in the world? Well, Jesus' message isn't about that. Is it about you right where you are? In the ordinary, not the extraordinary. That's where we're called So it's a real challenge if you're trying to be exciting and perform some big spectacle, but also be authentic. Well, that's very difficult. And then you've got to compete with everything around, and you're going to struggle to succeed. And then finally, it's what Laquise calls singularity. I might just call it the myth of uniqueness. That, well, we have to be fundamentally different from everything else in order to grab attention. Well, much of what we do is not necessarily different from what the church has done for a very long time. It's about loving one another. It's about sharing the gospel. It's about serving those in need. These are not new things. But if the focus is what's new and different about your community versus others, now we are being defined by these tiny things that are different, and the core of who we are, Jesus' death and resurrection, is lost in the mix because it wasn't new and exciting. It happened 2,000 years ago, but it's the center of our theology. So you lose the center in order to have the new exciting thing. This is one version of what Laquise says. This is unhelpful. This is not a functional thing. I'm not saying this is obvious that people are specifically trying to be unhelpful, but that's what's happened. Second one is resignation. We see decline among us and we just kind of give up. And that happens from a couple different ways. One is from complacency. We simply are happy. This is serving our needs. We see it declining, but it still is already serving our needs, so why bother doing much else? And complacency is probably the most common reason resignation happens. And it's difficult because the reason complacency happens very frequently is because what we're doing really is serving our needs. But it is not attracting others, and it is not fulfilling the mission of Jesus to be doing outreach to those and sharing the good news with others. But if the goal is myself, am I being cared for in a particular community? Well, you might be. And thereby being just complacent. And many of us have had the experience that he talks about in the book of going to a new church and people are basically pretty cold to you. They're not, they don't welcome you, they don't talk to you, they don't mind you're there, but really you're not part of it. This is complacency. That's probably the most common reason for the tacit resignation. But then the other is more challenging, which is denial, which is to say we see our church shrinking, but it's not our fault. And actually, it's a good thing. And what Laquise calls a remnant idea, I would call it the purity spiral of saying, we proclaim a gospel that's unpopular. Jesus taught a gospel that's unpopular, and we're going to really hold to it, and people around us don't like it. We're at enmity with those who are around us, so therefore it's not a surprise to us that people are not coming to our church, because after all, we're the ones who speak the truth, and people don't want to hear the truth. And pretty soon, in that logic, the smaller you get, the better you feel about it. And that's why I call it a spiral, a purity spiral. We're the pure truth. And the book is speaking in many ways to conservative Christians. I'm part of a progressive church. Same thing in progressive churches. We're the ones who really care and are really welcoming. Most people don't want to be welcoming. They don't want to care. And we can do the same thing and feel so good about ourselves that we have come to this place of the true gospel of Jesus, that we feel good that others don't seem to want to come. I was once part of a pastor's group talking about evangelism, and one person's first thing said was, well, I've always made clear that evangelism won't have anyone new come to our congregation. And the idea was, well, it's not about necessarily our own church growing, but that the fact that was the first response seems to be suggesting, no, we're doing our mission, but it's not going to grow. There's not going to be any more participation. There's not going to necessarily be any trust built. What are we competent to do? What is it that are we reliable to do? What are we honest about? What our actual goal is? And so that can happen. And then the last one, of course, is just despair. I have no idea what to do, so I just give up trying because it takes a lot of effort. And that one maybe we can understand the best, but is another move that is relatively unhelpful. And then the last one is resistance. That we see Christendom lost, we want to take it back. And this is, the book talks a lot about conservative Christianity. I'm speaking to a progressive audience, but one is to understand what's happened in conservative Christianity, but the other is to say, I'm not so convinced that progressive Christians don't do this too. And the book, by the way, does not say progressive Christians don't do this. It's just speaking to a different group. And in it, one of his points is, it is becoming more and more the case in churches in America that political affiliation and church affiliation are becoming a one-to-one. That is, there are churches on the left for the people politically on the left, and there are churches on the right for people politically on the right. And when that happens, then what can so quickly happen is that we begin using legislative power in order to try to reestablish Christendom. On the right, we see this happening right now in government because they have a government on the right doing this through the courts and different things. We're going to enact the policies we want. On the left, very frequently we're doing the same thing. We are trying to lobby Congress or lobby things to get what we want on the agenda and passed, because has it become simply a political organization? That fundamental question is coming up too frequently. And I just say that because I think many readers of this book would say, well, this is really a thing for those on the right, Christian nationalism, so on. I would say the same tendency is there on the left. We may not be as good at it, but it's very much there as well. And it leads toward, well, you'll just do anything to win because it's about winning and getting your side to do this. Because again, that's back to what we talked about last time about social power. You don't need to convince people if you use social power. You just use the power. Power is about enacting something, and it's not about building trust, working with others. It's about enacting something. Well, that really easily can lead to just basically do anything you can to win. And it's going to come off that way. If you're trying to become trustworthy, well, that's not going to work. And it often leads to a very weak identity. What makes us different and distinct? What are we doing that's just different from, if we're a progressive church, than just general progressive causes? How is this about the ministry and mission of Jesus in our community where we are? We don't have a lot to do about making huge international statements. For example, sometimes we can want to make a public statement that will lobby Congress to do something. Well, as one church in Eugene, Oregon, you have to ask that competence question. Are we really able to do anything with that? Maybe you can. Maybe it is helpful. But we should recognize what it is and what our mission is. And what makes us different than just, are we signing on to something that a whole bunch of people are signing on to do? It's okay to do those things, but recognize what's your identity? Why are you doing this? And how is that serving our mission? And in all of this, what is lost? In what Laquise calls relevance, resignation, and resistance, is how are we being the hands and feet of Jesus? How are we being faithful to our calling? How are we proclaiming the death and resurrection of Christ and the power of God in this world if we are trying these stratagems in order to try to gain people back into our church? This is God's church and God's action after all. So I feel what is helpful in this is these are three common pitfalls. They're not the only pitfalls. But how do we measure what kind of trustworthiness we are upholding? We need to be the Church of Christ, and if we really are being the Church of Christ, that is a community that is trustworthy. But it happens from what are we actually doing, and how are we doing it? What are we competent to do? What should we be doing? How is that? What are we able to accomplish and fulfill our mission? Are we reliable? Are we really going to do that? And can we name what we're actually doing? Are we honest about it? Are we able to say, this is who we are and this is who we're not? This is where we've tried to be the hands and feet of Jesus. This is where we fail, because we do fail. And that's one thing that we're going to get later in this study, as we are a community that believes that we are sinful people who err. We're not going to do this perfectly, but we can be honest about that. And we can say that this is our mission, and we will fail, and we confess our sinfulness, and we have room for that. And that's one thing that is distinctive and different within our culture. We'll get to more of that in the future. This has been the second chapter, or the second session of our class, How the Light Shines Through, correlating to chapter 1 of the book. Look forward for this continued book study, and contact me with any feedback or questions. Pastor Ben at welcometocentral.org. I'm Pastor Ben. Thanks for watching.